thanks a lot for coming along. Really appreciate there's kind of 40 or so in the room and then many more people online listening in. And we'll put this on our YouTube channel. So there's a YouTube channel for the Nonlinear and Complex Physics group, which has got lots of interviews with people who have perspectives on complexity theory. So do check that out. So my name is Mark Hardman, but I'm welcoming you as a committee member for the Nonlinear and Complex Physics group. So we're one of about 50 groups that the Institute of Physics supports, and our role really is to be a centre for discussion for the nonlinear and complexity physics community, and that includes conversations that move beyond physics and think about social science, education, management, and so that's why Jean and I kind of represented here as well. We host a programme of events. There's another one coming up, so the 25th to 26th of November, we are holding an event on statistical physics of cognition, so have a look at that if you're interested in that one. But Jean, you were part of the inaugural committee.
2008.
2008,
Yes.
And I joined about 2 years later. So we're going to be talking here to you today about you. About you. So let me give an introduction to Jean. Jean's a fellow of the Institute of Physics. She studied physics at Oxford and Cambridge and did research in applied physics, moving towards research in management, consultancy, more study, ended up more of a social scientist. And you're a visiting fellow at the Cranfield School of Management and the Department of Social and Policy Studies at the University of Bath. I know you're a research fellow at the Stellenbosch Institute, and there's people connected with that as well. And you've had teaching positions all over the world. Lead author of the Embracing Complexity book in 2015 that a lot of us know, that you wrote with Peter Allen and Cliff Bowman. But this book is fantastic. I've read it much faster than I would normally read a book, but it's really kind of engaging in its scope and style, and I'm looking forward to talking to you about that. But we're going to start with a presentation to give a bit of an overview of the book, and then me and you will have a conversation. I'll ask you some questions, and then we'll open that out to the floor and online. So yeah, take it away, Jean.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Yes, well, good evening, everybody. I'm so pleased you could come, and so pleased to be here. It's really nice to be doing this event at the Institute of Physics, yeah. So what I'm going to try and do in about 20 minutes is give an overview of these ideas that are embedded in the Dao of Complexity in the book. I can actually talk without drawing breath for at least an hour and a half, and if you don't believe me, some people here will have seen me do this. So I'm going to be quite brief, I hope, and I've asked Mark to yell at me after about 10 minutes so that I do manage the time. I don't want to talk too long, so there's lots to say. It's been, as you can imagine, it's quite difficult to summarize the book. So I want, you saw this this poem that I wrote in 2009 on a train going home to Somerset. You get prizes for knowing what county of origin I came from, where I was born. You know, just that's a joke. Yes, okay. So I was born in Yorkshire, and this whole story of the of the way that complexity theory arose is in a sense summarised in this poem in a rather interesting way. So what the core of my project in this book, in my work, this has been something that actually started in STIAS at the University of the Stellenbosch Institute of Advanced Study. This is what has really interested me about this is, what can we say about the way the world really is, you know, or the way the universe really is, or the way communities change, the way societies are, the way ponds are. So this is really embedded in what social scientists call an ontological quest. It's a question of, you know, what is the nature of reality, including, like, is there one? Which of course quantum physics messes things up for us. What's the nature of change? Is there something that happens at different scales, at different levels, that's kind of constant? And what is that? And if we understood that, would it help us to navigate the world better? Would we do a better job of being in the world, you know, in whatever that means for us? So that's really, this book in a way is trying to inquire what is the nature of things, does complexity have something to offer that? You know, what is going on? I'm being yes, sorry, I'm being slightly distracted by being photographed. So, but don't worry. So the one of the real important things that I want to say, that in a sense physicists would know, but is not always obvious to non-physicists, is that physics as a whole doesn't really paint a picture of a machine-like universe, of a deterministic universe. It isn't saying that. There are bits of physics that are universal theories, that are deterministic. In other words, if you know the initial starting point, you know everything else forever. But when they all act on messy stuff, on the kind of starting point of the universe where you've got clouds of energy and dust that are messy, that are not symmetrical. In fact, had they been symmetrical, we wouldn't have got the galaxies and the kind of evolution of the universe that we have. So if you add all the bits together, then we're not really looking at, you know, physicists are not telling you that the world works like a machine. Nor are physicists telling you that the world finds an equilibrium. And although there are aspects of physics that say those things, what's happened over the years is that the management people like a good machine metaphor. So they're always looking for cause and effect, certainty, planning. That's their kind of, you know, physics, the science of choice. And the economists want a good equilibrium. And the reason for both of those is it makes the maths easy. But as Thorsten Veblen said in the late 19th century, you know, only an idiot would think that economics was other than an evolutionary science. He wrote a very scathing, I wish I could be so scathing and in such beautiful prose, but he wrote about in 1898 why the economy doesn't reach equilibrium. It's an evolutionary process. So I'm really keen in the book to try and explain as well as I can, to debunk this idea of both the machine worldview as adopted by the social world, or this kind of, you know, this focus on, if we assume that we don't get very far away from equilibrium, then all sorts of things can be said about the economic world. So that's the start of the book. And to put it in slightly different language, it's that the thermodynamics messes up the deterministic physics. You know, it's the messiness of heat and things banging into each other that's a very important part of the physics of the universe, as is the fact that no situations that we're looking at are closed systems, that everything is open to its surroundings, and if it weren't, we wouldn't have the kind of world that we have. So that's the kind of the first part of the book is around that. I then start to describe a take on complexity that emphasizes the flowing, becoming aspect of complexity. So the first part of the book is what I've called making sense. It's really saying, let's really dig down as well as we can into what's the world really like? What do these scientific views and other views, you know, what can we learn about the nature of the way things are, the way things change? You know, if we understand that well, then we'll do a better job of acting in that world. And the second part of the book is what I've called making waves. And I've used that deliberately. I had a discussion with the publisher who wanted me to call it making change. And I was saying, well, no, we can't say that because we don't know whether we're going to make change. All we can do sometimes is make waves. You know, we may have intentions, we may be doing things, but we don't actually know where it's going. But how do we show up and do our best to make the kind of input to the world that we're trying to do? So that's the kind of overview of the book. And I'm not going to say very much about this, but this idea of how do we get the first part of the book starts with Isaac Newton. And at the time, and I never remember we ever did this. When you study physics, you do the maths of Newton. You work out. You're taught how to solve equations, but you don't get into the philosophy of whether this makes a good worldview. If can Newton's theories be abstracted to the universe as a whole. And even Leibniz at the time was questioning whether that was possible. And I won't go into the detail of that. But this idea, so I start with Newton and I work through to Ilya Prigogine, who got the Nobel Prize for his work on the open systems, the physics of open systems. And that led into complexity theory. So I'm, as a physicist by background, I'm particularly attracted to the physics and biological ways into complexity theory. They're not constraining things to be modelable or mathematical. It's really asking the question, what's really going on here? What can we understand? What can we see? What can we experience about the world? Rather than, in a sense, immediately start to think about whether we can map it. So this is kind of the tradition that I've worked in. There's a little bit that I talk about how quantum mechanics also messes things up. And this is a whole, as people here will tell you if they're physicists. Anybody who thinks that they understand quantum mechanics is lying. I think it was Richard Feynman that said that originally. It's a very complex subject in terms of what it means, but what it does introduce is a kind of really intrinsic subjectivity or uncertainty at the very nature of the universe. So there's something that goes on in the interstitial stuff that isn't really stuff. You know, when you get right down to it, you know, you're not quite sure what's there. But contradictory things can be true at the same time, depending on your point of view. And I don't mean a human point of view. I mean, you know, if this gravitational fluctuation is looking at this quantum fluctuation, and this quantum fluctuation is also looking at this gravitational fluctuation, something different may transpire at the same time, even though those things are contradictory. So there's something very mysterious and important that debunks the idea of a kind of machine universe. If only we knew how all the bits fitted, then we could predict the future. So that's the sort of start of what I talk about in the book. So let me move on to process complexity. So I've been writing and working in the field of complexity theory since the late 1990s. I got very I found this theory and somehow it made perfect sense to me. It was what I'd been looking for in terms of, you know, wow, finally something makes sense of my experience of the world and it fits with my understanding of physics too. And the first book that I wrote with Peter Allen and Cliff Bowman describes complexity theory in some detail. But what I've done in this book is take a more, I've emphasized what Prigogine said, which was the world is always becoming. And it moves this idea of primacy from, you know, there's a world of being, which occasionally changes, and a world in constant flux, which occasionally remains still. So the process philosophy is really emphasizing that flow and change is the norm. And sometimes things get locked in and stuck or sometimes self-regulate in a very positive sense and patterns sustain. But it's underneath even sustainable patterns, you know, the swans are paddling their feet under the water, so to speak. It's the kind of reflexive interactions between things that sustain patterns. So that what I'm really describing is a world in process. And what I'm also discussing in the book is this idea that things are not really things, that we in a sense are all processes. We're all processes that to varying degrees are sustained. So if you look at a galaxy, a brain, an ecology, a family, if you take a family, for example, it will have patterns that sustain. You know, if if I come to tea in your house, you will have a way of doing things, and I will observe the dynamics in your family and who talks to which kid, and what happens, who does the washing up and all those kind of things. There will be sustainable patterns that are sustained through the interactions, the kind of reflexive relationships between people and things. And each family will be different. Well, that's also true of galaxies, brains, ecologies, and anything else. Any system of things interacting reflexively, where A affects B and B affects A again, and then C comes in, and A affects C and C affects B, then C leaves, those kind of things that go on in a family. That's what everything is like in, almost everything is an open system. And that's what I'm interested in. And my question in this part of the book is to say, well, are there general themes? Are there things that I can understand that apply at all levels? Can I understand what this processual world is like? Because I'm not just seeing everything flows and we can't really know anything. I'm not describing just a kind of bubbling, chaotic stream of messiness in this. What we find in the world is it shows up as patterns of relationships. There are things that sustain in the way that you will have patterns of norms and behaviors in your family or in an organization. If you go to different organizations, you will find ways of doing things or a particular culture or vibe that will be, tangibly different from somewhere else. So in terms of working with complexity, what we're not saying is you have to know everything about everything in order to get anywhere, and it's all too complex, what shall we do? What you're saying is that the science of open systems, the science of the complex world, demonstrate that things often and tend to show up as patterns. So what we need to do is to get to understand those patterns in order to decide, in order for it to inform us about how to work well with what goes on. If I want to change an organization, if I can understand those patterns and norms, I can be more skilled at intervening. So there's something about patterns that's really important. And one way to understand process complexity is to say that the world, these patterns of relationships are kind of constantly in process of either emerging, stabilizing, or dissolving. There's something about that as a kind of way of thinking about the world that's really important. And these words at the bottom are the way I've kind of expressed this process world in a little bit more detail, which we might come back to. So what about Taoism then? This book's called The Dao of Complexity. I knew about Taoism. I was one of those teenagers who read philosophy textbooks for fun, and I knew about Taoism. But Peter Allen, who I worked with for many years at Cranfield, came back from London in 2003, clutching the Tao Te Ching, Ames Hall, which he'd randomly picked up at a bookshop near Oldfield Tube Station. If you want to know where it was, it's something I've remembered very well. And he came back to Cranfield, where I was working at the time, and said, look at this. The introduction to the Tao Te Ching reads just like a complexity theory textbook. It's the same. And this was so intriguing to me that it set me off on a journey from 2003 to really explore this. And I've particularly worked with the work of Ames and Hall, who, for reasons I explain in the book, I think are very good scholars of Taoism. I'm very much interested in its cosmology. What is it saying about the way the world changes, the way the world is? And it's experientially derived. It's almost identical to the view emerging from the science of complexity. And perhaps part of what's at the core of it is expressed in this wander, there is no path, you lay down a path in walking, which is quite a central kind of idea that that comes from it's a translation of Machado, who wrote this particular statement. And it's really saying what I've been saying, which is the Taoists are not saying there's a path and you join it. They're saying we co-create the future through our collective actions. Now, obviously, there's been people before me, so I step into something that's already, happened. But I'm able to co-create the future with you all. It's a collective view of how things are created. It's contextual, it's path dependent, it's not suggesting that there's a kind of overarching kind of way of doing things or a set path. It's not like there's a path and I should find it. It's like I need to attune to what is, but I'm also have agency in making the choices I do about what's going to happen. So the cosmology, which I have read and read and read, and found enormously interesting and really learnt in many ways a lot about complexity through that kind of interplay. Mark, do tell me when I've got just 5 minutes to go. I probably have already, yeah. The Tao Te Ching also proffers advice about, in a sense, how to cultivate yourself. So it's not just saying, this is an understanding of the world. There's lots about paradox that's intrinsic to the Tao. That when things begin, they're already, imagining their ending. When things are stable, there's always some instability. It's got this kind of paradoxical quality that's embedded in this experientially derived philosophy. How did they know this? They knew it through being in it. So moving very quickly on, I've also been interested in the work towards this book, in how the degree to which I kept finding resonances with process complexity, with very different perspectives. So I came across this book, David Eagleman, on the brain, and the way he describes the plasticity of the brain, how things both become a sustained pattern and yet can change. Absolutely the same as the kind of story that you get from process complexity. I got very interested in the work of political writers, and these were political writers who were in the regimes. They were actually talking about experience. It wasn't a theorizing about things. They talk a lot about the way power gets locked in and stuck, that when, if the path dependency of power means that it is very difficult to challenge if you leave it too late, as we know. And these books are about how the path of power gets locked in, and both how to stop that happening and what to do about it. So what I've enjoyed in these kind of resonances with complexity, I guess, is two things. First of all, if all these people who've never heard the word complexity theory are saying similar things about the way the world works, maybe there's something worth listening to here. Maybe we're onto something that's useful. And the second reason I've really enjoyed them is that they from in different ways offer perspectives on practice that make me think. So some of the work from Daoism, which talks very much about this idea of understanding the beginning of a beginning, that if we can apprehend the tiny signs of change, we can be much more adept at actually preserving them or doing the opposite. So all these different perspectives have something to offer to practice. And there's quite a lot of that I talk about. So what does all this mean then for the individual, for organisations, for tackling global issues? And the second half of the book is really addressing this question in a variety of ways. And a lot of this is about stories and examples and quirky things that happened and conversations I had with people that got me thinking. So this is not a book of frameworks. This is a book to make you think. It's actually been written a bit like the Tao, in small pieces that you can pick up and read. Hopefully they're annoying, they make you think, don't agree with them, wander around the book, argue with me. I argue with myself in bits of the book. It's a way of bringing alive a worldview. It's not a way of saying, ergo, here's some methods. There are methods within it, but they're not the main focus. I'm not trying to turn this into a methods book. Some of the so what so, I'll just talk about one of these, is so what, if the world's complex, what are you supposed to do then? And one of the practices that I think, shows up whether you're walking into a classroom or you're lion hunting or you know, you're dealing with a whole of society, is how can we apprehend what's there in you know, how can we see the patterns that are there? How do we look wide enough and deep enough and broad enough to actually be attuned in both a rational and an intuitive way to apprehending those patterns? Because if we can really get to grips with what's there, then we're going to do a better job of actually acting. Sometimes if we've understood the kind of, you know, if you imagine you're bird watching or lion hunting, if you're apprehending the scene, you've understood what's there, your eye will catch that, you know, that small change, which is what you're looking for. So there's something about how to do that. And you know, there's a phrase, seeing simplicity on the other side of complexity. So don't try and overly define your boundaries or decide what's in the problem. Keep going wider. You know, well, if there's something else that's important here, you know, keep going, you know, but look for the kind of the patternings that maybe come out of that broad perspective that is the simplicity on the other side of complexity. So don't constrain too early. So I think one final thing to say, and then I'm going to stop. I've talked about the path is made through walking, and the so what for me, and I think this kind of comes up whether I'm, you know, sitting drinking coffee with my friend at home, or I'm thinking about, you know, big questions about climate change and inequality, is that what really has struck me in writing in this book more than anything is that what we believe matters. What we do matters, but what we believe matters. You know, if you think people are basically selfish, you will build a whole political and economic system based on, you know, you've got to control them because they're either stupid or selfish. You know, that we can get told that humans are selfish. The evolutionary biologists show us that that humans have both an ability to be selfish and an ability to be other-centered. You know, we wouldn't have communities, and we wouldn't be able to hunt. We wouldn't be able to bring up children if we didn't have both qualities. So what we believe will drive in a path-dependent way what then seems like a good economic system or a good political system. So beware. You know, think about. I've talked about the beliefs about the relevant science. You know, if you think the world is a machine, you're going to make all sorts of demands and decisions about how to manage people, which are different than if you think the world is sometimes stable, but I've got to be alert to emerging signs of change, which may be the very place where I can really make a difference, you know, where things can change. So beliefs matter. And that probably, of all the things that that come out of this for me, has been a very important point.
Oh, thank you. That's great. And you've preempted some of the questions I've had, but I've been fortunate, as I said, I kind of read it faster than I wanted to. These are all notes, and these are notes which are questions to me. And I think you spoke to that a little bit in that. One of the things I very much enjoyed about the text was the character of the pieces that you put together with art, with quotations, and how that kind of really allows you to speak to yourself, but also have a dialogue with the text. I found some of your character in it, Jean, having known you for about 15 years, very knowledgeable, but also kind of wanting to have conversations and open to conversations. And it's strange to say that about a text, but you really do feel like you're in dialogue with it. I'd also say that one of the things I found really impressive, and I'd love to echo in my own work, is kind of the performative nature of the overall piece is greater than the parts. And I think that's because there are concepts that are preempted and come back throughout the pieces. So you could probably read it in a non-linear way. I didn't this time, but I think I'll now dip back into it with those questions and pick things up as well. It's also very ambitious. And I think that's fantastic, the way that you've kind of taken that on. Again, part of your character, I would say. but you're in dialogue with you know, people like Einstein and Prigogine and Bergson, but also some of the people in the room. I don't know whether people know they've been cited and referenced yet, but they'll figure that out as they read it. And I thought that was really, really powerful. So there's a few key contributions, I think, in the book, and one of them for me is the process complexity. And as a physicist, I spent a lot of time in the appendices working out where you've come from the quantum physics angle to get to that. So as you said in that presentation, you've really engaged with the kind of physics nature of uncertainty and flow. And then from that, you talk about patterning, process, and paradox. And I found that really interesting. But I guess the paradox wasn't something I'm used to thinking about. So maybe you did talk about it a little bit, but maybe you could talk about that a little bit more. What do you mean when you're talking about paradox in relation to this?
I think there are two aspects to that to say something about. So there is a kind of paradoxical quality about the stuff of the universe that quantum physics brings in a way that is not entirely cannot entirely be pinned down. So people may have heard of the kind of the idea of Schrodinger's cat. You know, is the cat alive or dead? Well, you know, if you don't look, it's both alive and dead. What does that mean? And there's something about the kind of coherent aspects of the quantum world that bring in an idea of something I've called it is like a sort of, you know, it's a bit like the universe is mysterious to itself. The universe is subjective to itself. There's something not quite there. When you get down to it, it isn't just made of stuff like building blocks that you then build into a thing. So that paradoxical quality of, you know, mystery. One of my colleagues, Chris Clark, who was a mathematical physicist who wrote about quantum mechanics, talks about, you know, and it's a Leonard Cohen phrase, you know, it's the crack is where the light gets in. There's something that you can't quite make it all fit in a kind of machine kind of way. There is a mystery, and there's a paradox. You know, it's things can be different, things that are incompatible can be true in different contexts. Is something that we're talking about the very, you know, kind of the fabric, not that it's a fabric of the universe. So there's paradox in that way. And I think that more prosaically, the complex world is full of paradox. So stability is created by the constant interweaving of the constituent parts of it. Buddhists have a phrase, they call it empty. So a pattern is actually empty because things that aren't really things, they're kind of co-created and held in place by these interweavings. But the very interweaving that keeps things stable, paradoxically, is also the thing that leads to change. So that there's these paradoxes. If you take a political paradox, you know, if you take the ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity, they're paradoxical. If you say no, my philosophical view is freedom is the most important thing. You know, we're having freedom. Then you get into all sorts of problems about how do communities work. If you go the opposite way and say it's all about community, we're going to institute communitarian processes and there's no freedom and we should be, you know, downplaying individuality, that doesn't work. And if you try and work with these polarities and understand them as kind of, in a sense, mutually exclusive, then you're having to work in the real world with the paradox. You'd know this as parents, you know, when do you say, okay, that's it now, you're not having that, you know, it's enough, go to bed. Not that anybody does that anymore, but I can remember it. Through to, you know, what we call in my local town free range children, you know, who know no boundaries, you know, and so on. So what's the right answer? Well, there isn't a right answer. What's the right answer in your family? What's the right answer now is going to be different to somebody else's family and indeed yours at a different time and what mood you're in. Now, you know that, you know, you don't find it difficult for me to say that. If I was a social worker and I came to your family and said, I've sat here for 2 days and I'm going to say your family is outstanding, but your family is poor. And here's a checklist of things you have to do differently. This may remind you of how we deal with schools. You'd laugh at me and you'd take me out of the door. But we have a way of not wanting to embrace those paradoxical, complex aspects where there's always some truth in the opposite. And one of the maxims, one of the ways I make this operational for myself is if I say anything about anything, I say to myself, well, what's the truth in its opposite? And there's always some truth in its opposite. So
Right, and that process philosophy allows you to link those kind of quantum ways of thinking about things, but also the very human, and then you go on to organizations and the global, which I think
yeah,
is really good. So that, yeah, the process view shifted the way that I think most people think of complexity, or certainly I did, being trained as a physicist dealing with semiconductors around there are entities and they're connected, but the processor view I think really changes that, which is great. And you said something earlier about how we apprehend those systems, and that kind of feeds
yes,
into what my second question was. Really, you say at one point, methods of engaging with complex situations are best when they echo the qualities of those situations. So we have complex methods, I assume, for complex ways of engaging. So, I mean, a broad question is, what are you saying about ways of knowing? You talked about subjectivity as well on a deeper level there. So.
yes, yeah. No. So subjectivity. What does subjectivity mean? Is something I've written about. I guess what I'm thinking about with when I'm dealing with the social and natural world, there are kind of four questions I've got. Is one of them is, what's kind of interwoven and systemic? What matters here? So, if I'm an economist and I miss out the pandemic, what was the biggest thing to happen to the economy in what was it, 2020, 2019? It was the pandemic. It was COVID. If you narrow your view, if you don't look at those interweavings, then you may miss the very thing that's actually pertinent. So there's something about, am I prepared to ask these questions, even if some of them are unanswerable, about what's woven, what's the systemic nature of the thing that matters. Then I'm going to say, what's my method for pattern spotting? How am I going to know in this situation what's the best way of understanding what the dominant and relatively stable patterns are? My third question is then, what's the way I'm going to notice emerging shoots of change, little changes that I can, that may be useful to know about if I can apprehend those little tiny changes of change, the sort of, how do you know as a teacher the signs that this is a pre-learning environment? The kids are just starting to warm up to learning, but there's nothing to show for it. You can't point to anything and say they've learned that, but you have a sense, a glimmer in the room that there's something new happening. So there's something about how do we apprehend glimmers of change. And then the final one that you need, because this is a very dynamic view, is what's the method I'm going to have to actually understand the dynamics? How am I going to track change over time? Now, if you take those four questions, there is a place for a more kind of hard-edged data. I'm not anti quantitative information when it's appropriate, but it's how do you not just rely on that? How do you? So, for example, I did some work in North Kenya a few years ago, which was looking at why people hadn't called drought in 2011 and 12. And the answer was because by the time you have quantitative measures, it's too late. There's a drought because people are dying and the cattle are dead, and there's nothing to eat. If you want to have confidence in your judgment that this is a drought, this is important, you're going to have to do that through building trusted relationships with local people over a period of time, and visit and have much more of a kind of not just an intuitive sense, but an informed sense of judgment that comes from knowing people, trusting them. And if somebody very well says, well, my granddad's been a nomad, and he's out there and he's telling me he's not seen anything like this for 50 years, then you're going to be more confident to actually make some kind of judgment. So this is not a kind of, everything's got to be qualitative, but we've got to mix up the qualitative and the quantitative. We've got to work out how stable this situation is. And I think what we get wrong sometimes in approaches to change is we don't pay enough attention to these growing, emerging shoots of change, or the unraveling of what's going on. You know, how do we become more alert to that? So
Yeah, and I think you tell a story in the book of a field that's got no seagulls above it or no birds above it because the worms and the soil is inert and therefore
yeah,
not supporting life. And I really enjoyed those kind of able to mix the different
stories.
stories that are in there. It really,
Yeah.
really helps. Even when you're talking and wanting to make notes and link things to my ideas, and that's part of why the book's so good. So if you'll indulge me a minute, I mean, it got me thinking about quite a few different theorists and things that are happening in the world, really. And I think that's really helpful. It puts the book in conversation. There's a whole section where you do kind of make some lines of flight to other thinkers. But for me, let me give you three examples. So Deleuze is mentioned, and he's a theorist that I work with quite a lot, Deleuze and Guattari. But he's also talking about becoming, and he was inspired by complexity theory around there. And you talked about ontology earlier, which is a word not everybody will understand, but to do when you're talking about events, patterns, and things all being the same stuff, and you talk about waves, which I think is really helpful. People are kind of they can be seen as waves, and things can be seen as waves, all made of the water, but still having a form as well. I think that's really helpful. So Deleuze also talks about overcoming differences between matter and mind, about humans and non-humans, and again, you're saying, in Ravelli's quantum gravity, moving away from events and forces being separate things. So there seems to be some synergies there. You said resonances earlier, so maybe I'll adopt the resonances. But in completely different fields as well. So Donna Haraway is a feminist, post-humanistic scholar, although she's moving away from that. You were talking about Staying with the Trouble, which is one of her works, and I think you named one of the pieces after that work, but you also talk in another piece about we're all in the soup, which you take from Daoism. And Haraway's got these phrases about we're all compost or we're all hummus. And again, trying to move away, even beyond posthumanism, to think about how we're interlinked with the world around us, thinking about the way you notice, but moving away from separations of known and knower, which I think you do there as well. And then in kind of more literary circles, you were talking about leadership as process, and that reminded me a lot of Bell Hook's work on love as process. And she says love as a verb, but I understand there's no distinction, you were saying, between verbs and nouns necessarily in Chinese philosophy, but still that kind of self-indulgent talking about what this has meant to me, I think it echoes the point that there's a lot of resonances and synergies with trying to move to a different worldview or trying to understand new ways of thinking because we're in a particular time of crisis. And I wondered whether you'd got any perspective on why are so many different fields trying to move on their worldviews and trying to change the overarching kind of philosophies underpinning things.
That's a little question,
Yeah,
isn't
yeah.
it? Yes, I think that partly the idea that things don't go to plan is kind of dawning on people. You know, it's hard to get away from it.
Yeah.
Although it does sometimes have the opposite reaction, which is when people start to feel that things are unraveling. You know, some people will just control it even harder. So that happens as well. But I think the thing that I've taken from my own research and writing this and kind of living with this book, I feel like I've carried this book around with me. The inquiry that underpins this book has been in my back pocket for every conversation. It's beware of me at dinner parties, because I might just sort of go down a rabbit hole because somebody says something, I think, well, that's really interesting, that fits with what I was thinking here. So but I think that what I feel is that when I read certain political commentators, and there's been loads, that Maria Ressa's written about the Philippines and how to stand up to a dictator. There's people like Eke Temel Kuran, who's written about Turkey and wrote a very prescient book about how she's written this book, called The Seven Steps from Democracy to Dictatorship. And it's very prescient in terms of some of the things that we see around us. So I think part of what's been empowering for me is I go to all these different places and there's something the same, that when people draw on their experience, a kind of embedded view of the world, rather than a kind of theory that they want to impose on the world, they come to similar conclusions, whether it's 5th century BC or Native American wisdom or Ravelli. When I remember the day I was going on holiday and I ended up being bought this present on the way we were going away, this present of Ravelli's book, On Time, and that was me done for the whole of Christmas. Then I was just reading this book, going, "Oh, look, he says this," and if we can go from quantum gravity, complexity, Daoism, political commentators, and we start seeing these resonances, well, maybe we're learning something about the way things are. And it's not saying, it's people love saying this to me in coffee shops all over the place. It's like, I am not just saying, honestly, I really am not saying the world is very complex, get over it. I'm saying if we embrace the complex interweaving of things, then we find these kind of patternings that are always becoming, but often stay the same for a long time, sometimes get very locked in, sometimes collapse. But that understanding this idea of the dynamic, the patterning, and then this other practice which says, sometimes I feel that it's easy to focus on the stability. So systems methods can often tell you an awful lot about the current stable patterns, but we've also got to have a practice of noticing. It isn't an intellectual abstract practice. It's like, do I notice what's changing? And that's the kind of, so I think it's similar because there's something, isn't it exciting that all these different, people and thinkers, people who really think, they engage their thinking from their embodied experience, come up with a similar understanding of the way the world works.
I mean, there's actually a lot more in the book about kind of what you think we should do. So I'm going to be mean and say, what should we do? So we've got about 4 minutes. If you could explain what we should do, please.
I think that the core of all the things I've taken from this, from myself, and I've got more convinced about this in a way, is we have to show up. So we don't know whether we're, what our agency is. If I use the example of Nelson Mandela, Nelson Mandela, if you've gone to Robben Island, spent 21, 22 years in one cell, go and see the cell, he, and people tear up in South Africa, whatever their background is. People love Nelson Mandela. I've talked to all people from, very different backgrounds, and people feel the same about Nelson Mandela. For 21 years, he maintained his integrity. He maintained his viewpoint. He didn't decide, he'd give, trade information for food. He was so authentic to himself. He showed up. He didn't waver. And he must have had, the likelihood was he was going to die, wasn't it? He was certainly the likelihood in his mind that he was going to hold the end of apartheid and become president would not have been in his head 15 years in, would it? But he didn't lose his integrity. And we don't know, what we're doing here, do we? We don't know. I might have a conversation with somebody here and it might just trigger something that really is important. So I feel that of everything that I would say to us all, whether we're talking about, being nice to somebody in the coffee shop, through to, challenging an economist giving a talk who talks about, how of course everybody's selfish, or of course there's no other way but growth, or whatever it is. Now you may not agree with those, but if I disagree with those, I feel I need to speak up. I need to speak up. I need to act. I need to act with integrity. I need to be authentic. And I think that's, more than anything, the message from the book. And one of the things I've come to feel quite strongly about is I think we have to read ideas through the person, that we think, as the Chinese have the word Zin, which means heart-mind. If you're reading somebody who's coming from the head and it's kind of disembodied, beware, because real wisdom comes from the heart-mind. So I've deliberately show myself in the book. You get to know me in the book, and it's because I want you to read what I'm saying through getting to know me as seeing my ideas through my embodied experience, if that makes sense. So it's a kind of pedagogical view, I think, isn't it?
Absolutely.
That's good.
That's
So,
great. We've come
thank you.
full circle round to what I like about the book now, which is the character of it and how it's got you in it. So I think it's time to open the floor to questions both here and online. I think we might just take a moment to let people gather their thoughts and then have hands up in the room. And then David's going to help us with online questions, and Ben's going to run around with a microphone. So anybody in the room got a question we'd like to start with? Jen, would you like to go first?
Well, Jean, congratulations on the book and your life's work as well. And my name is Jen, and I work on tackling complex challenges in the health sector. So I'm just really curious about you talked about the process of emergence, stabilization, and dissolving. And I know in my own leadership or in organizations, when things are really dissolving, like I have to really rely on my values. Like, what are our values here?
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, what do you think the role of values are in those three different phases? And do you think they're really, really important at the dissolving phase or important throughout? Maybe you could say a little bit more about the role of values in all of that.
Well, I think that's a really lovely question. Paul Cilliers, who wrote a book called Complexity and Postmodernism, points out that that we never get away from values. That because we're making decisions about, what's the boundaries of this problem, or what am I looking at here? You can't in any kind of problem, you will have values, whether it's like you think people are stupid, or you think those guys don't matter, we'll save these people, or the natural world doesn't matter. Well, the way you draw your boundaries means that in the complex world, values are always within it. And I think because of this idea of the path is made through walking, um, Aldous, I can't say the word, Aldous Huxley brought out this idea of, can we ever say that the end justifies the means? In other words, if I've got a good outcome, I want to make this change here. So, I'll do a bit of lying or, lack of clarity here, but that's okay because it'll get us to where we want to go. What the complexity view would be is you don't know whether you're ever going to get there, but you're imbuing the system, you're seeding the system with lying. So if you have, it's impossible to imagine, but if you had a political system where lying becomes normalized, and people think it's a bit stupid and dim to tell the truth, that will become the future. We will get used. We will not know what's true and what isn't, because it doesn't. If it doesn't occur to people to tell the truth, and that's become normalized, it doesn't matter. That's a value that actually has an output. So whatever the situation, I think showing up with your values, being explicit about your values is absolutely fundamental, because it drives everything. So, great question, thank you.
Maybe we'll have one more in the room and then we'll go online. Yeah.
I am working in the space of systems and investment and finance, and how to bring systemic thinking and complexity into the world of investment and finance. And I'm wondering, I think we're in a moment where there's a real sense of there are boundaries that we can't cross, thinking in terms of planetary boundaries, a sense of urgency, things that are going wrong, where potentially we don't want to open everything up to everyone can come up with their own decision about what counts as a good route forward, because there are some things that just need to be respected at this point in time if we're not going to go down a catastrophic path. So my question is whether the way you've been talking about action and what needs to happen, does it have enough in terms of guiding action? If everyone absorbed this way of thinking, and was kind of acting in adopting this perspective that you're talking about, would you kind of have faith that that would lead us in the direction that we need to go? Or do we need another layer of, I guess you could call it a normative position on things need to go in this direction and not in that direction? Like, we have to stop burning fossil fuels, for example. Or could people still be left to arrive at their own conclusion that we can continue to burn fossil fuels?
Yeah, no, well, that's a good question too. So no, I one of the things I talk about in the book around leadership is this isn't just, you know, we need leaders, you know, we need leadership, we need, you know, there is a place for people who challenge, you know, who have a broader perspective. We need laws, you know, that one of the writers that one of the people that I think is really interesting is Maria Mazzucato, who's been talking about missions. You know, the idea that what we should be doing in politics is kind of creating a sense of vision, you know, a sense of an agenda, a mission, you know, through which people can kind of find their way to see what's valued in this society. So so we do need people to say, you know, climate change matters, you know, the future matters. You know, we haven't got enough, you know, absolutely. And some of what I write about, it's definitely, I'm giving my, you know, in my own way, I'm leading. You know, I'm not saying let's just all, you know, it's like the free market view in a sense is, well, we'll leave everybody to themselves. And, you know, the levels of inequality since 1989, you know, in the 1960s, the difference between managers and workers in the UK was a factor of 5, you know, the salaries. It's now over 150. You know, we have to stand up and say things. There's then the political processes of how you do that. But I think Maria Mazzucato's views of part of the role of the state is to create a vision. It's to create ways that there's innovation towards what you need. It's to, you know, Mark Carney, for example, he spoke about what is an economy for. You know, we have to have values that decide what it's for. You know, otherwise it ends up being something that gets, you know, makes the rich richer if we're not careful. So I do think there's a role for leadership and saying things. That's not the same as coercion, but it is creating a kind of, you know, process of leadership that draws people towards, and is brave. You know, we need politicians who have some bravery, you know, who have some vision and are prepared to stand up for things and tell people how it is. So thanks, great question.
Is there something of the paradox of the individual and the collective there as well?
Yes.
In the way that the
Yes.
collective is made up of individuals.
Individuals, yes, yes. So there's, again, you know, we're dealing with that paradox. You know, I want some freedom, but if my freedom is the expense of you, if I have the right values, I'm going to go, well, you know what, I'm not going to do that because I can. I'm going to think about, you know, the collective future. I'm going to think about the planet. I'm going to think about the future because, you know, apart from, as some speakers have said, you know, what do we want for our grandchildren? You know, what we do now is creating the future. Yeah, I don't know whether well, come back to you, Ian. Yeah, go on, David. Over to David.
David, we're getting questions from online.
There, excuse me, there have been a variety of great questions online, which we don't have time for all of them. We can start with 2. The first is, how can we make complexity literacy more attractive to traditional institutions, including educational institutions? And the second one, which I know Jean will enjoy very much, is how much does your thinking align or not with Dave Snowden?
Oh, blimey, that's
Which one do you want to do first?
Yes, I'll do the first one first. So a lot of the book is written, I'm kind of trying to say in a variety of ways, look, guys, if we keep doing what we've been doing, you know, if we run this school in these ways, it's not working, is it? So for example, Finland has been held up as a real example of a different way of teaching, a more systemic way of teaching than has been traditional in this country, where certainly in the past, you know, if literacy and numeracy rates were too low, then we cut out art and everything, and we just did more rote learning of numeracy and literacy. So it's a kind of machine perspective, isn't it? But if you look at you know, happiness in Finnish schools or numeracy and literacy, so they teach more systemically. They're more likely to teach, you know, here is a pond, you know, what's the maths of the pond, what's the geography of the pond, write a story about the pond, you know, tell me the history of the pond. So there's something more systemic. Now, I think this may be changing here. I'm not an expert in education, but we tend to want to in this country to stick with this machine view. If we don't control it, it'll get out of control. And I think the more we can look to different parts of the world, look to the past. You know, when people talk about you know, man is intrinsically selfish. If you look at what went on, you know, in my parents and certainly my grandparents, you know, the idea of borrowing a cup of sugar, or you know, the village brought the children up, you know, that we were much more used in certain societies in the world to be more community led than perhaps we are in parts of the West now. So I think we've got to show people that working more in this way is, you know, is both effective and efficient. It's actually both. You know, pretending things go to plan when they don't is not efficient as well as it's not effective. But there's a real reluctance in even things like having a kind of collective way of setting budgets that breaks down siloed boundaries and makes more sense and will probably save money. There's a lot of resistance to that. But I think we've got to keep saying, that's what I've done in my consultancy work, well, what would happen if we did it this way? Well, look at this example. Well, let's just try this as a pilot. You know, we've just got to keep pushing, I think. And it's to do with the kind of left brain, right brain, you know, power control kind of, it's all going to get out of control if I do this. But pretending the world goes to plan when it doesn't is neither efficient nor effective. It doesn't make it so. So that's my best answer to that. I don't feel I can answer entirely a conversation about you know, Dave Snowden. Dave Snowden is a very well known and great complexity thinker who's done a huge amount of work. He's very well known, has a huge following. He has some lovely work to do with working with narrative, which I think is absolutely beautiful. I'm sure he would probably say you know, I'm misunderstanding his work, but I think my feeling is that the world is always complex, and in certain stable situations it becomes, you know, perhaps more complicated or more simple. And there are certainly some problems that are more simple, but in the main, my stance is to say the world is always complex, and sometimes it stabilizes for a bit. But beware, because the very seeds of the future are in the unraveling of the stability. Now, he may very well say the same thing. So my stance is more to say that the complex world has certain periods where it's more stable, and certain periods indeed where it's more chaotic, but it's always complex. My ontology is kind of inclusive of the whole thing. So I think it's a different emphasis, perhaps, than mine. But that's perhaps that's as much as I can say, I think.
Great.
Ian had a question here.
Only to ask how, sorry, thank you for an excellent talk. Only to ask, how much do you think in management and social sciences are these ideas being taken on in Britain, do you think?
Well, it's a kind of yes and no. You know, there's a way in which it's quite depressing to think that Thorsten Veblen wrote his paper about, you know, complexity economics, if you like, evolutionary economics in 1898. You know, we seem to find it very difficult in certain cultures to give up on control, or give, you know, because the, you know, the people in control don't want to give up the control they have or the salaries they have. They're here, and and many more people, I think, are interested in what these ideas have got to offer and work with them. I think there's a bigger, you know, I've been involved in this for nearly 30 years now, and I would say that the ideas have always been there, but there's more people talking about them in different ways. But there is a resistance in the West, and an answer to a slightly different question is, well, if we get more and more rigid, if we get more and more unequal, you know, if we will not, you know, allow the kind of resilience, what you learned from complexity is that to be resilient is to allow diversity, is to allow movement and flow and energy, and you know, all that. If we start to lock down, and you know, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and you know, this happens and that happens, people can't live. It's something that Václav Havel says in his book The Power of the Powerless, which was written about the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia. He says, in the end, people just can't take it anymore. They just become themselves. You know, so there is a kind of way in which society, in a variety of ways or in part, may collapse. You know, things may collapse if we hold this rigidity. If you look at the history of societies, you know, if you've ever read the book Collapse by you know, Jared Diamond, you know, when societies get too greedy, too rigid, you know, too corrupt, they collapse. So I think, you know, that it's going to be interesting. I think we're in, you know, for an interesting ride the next decade or so.
Can I follow up? So I'm in education, and I've tried a few times to talk to new teachers about complexity theory, and they probably don't need it to start with. They want some certainty initially, and then as they kind of understand and notice and start to see the classroom, then you can start to bring in broader perspectives. I'm wondering how that is in kind of management. Do people start out their careers becoming managers because they want to do things fairly simply? I guess I'm asking, how resistant are managers to the more difficult work of thinking about complexity?
I think it depends, and it depends on the organisation. It depends on who is promoted. So we definitely, you know, when I've been in, you know, in the past, I've worked in large organisations, and you know, we always used to talk about, you know, the middle management layer. You know, they just wanted things to go to plan. You know, they tell me what to do and I'll do it. You know, don't make me think too hard. You know, that's a bit of an exaggeration. So there are people who in you know, who like concrete rational thinking, who want certainty. But you know, good leaders, you know, more progressive, more strategic, more long-sighted leaders, more emotionally intelligent leaders, and you know, one of the things that I talk about in the book, it doesn't mean we all have to be all of those things, but a sort of leadership team has got to be able to work out, you know, who handles you can't make things uncertain all the time for everybody. You're not saying, well, everything might emerge, you know, we'll just sit here and wait for emergence. You know, you're not saying that. You're saying, look, you guys go and do your thing, you know, we'll agree some objectives, you know, you do that well, we'll be thinking about some of these emergent changes, you know, and one of the questions I suggested to when I was doing some consultancy work in Kenya again, was I was saying, even if all you did is at the end of a meeting, every meeting, you said to whoever was in the room, is there anything new, interesting, you know, or unexpected that's happened? That's all you need to do to get people to feel that they're allowed to say, well, actually, I came across this really fantastic idea, or, you know, actually, this isn't working anymore for these reasons. But we don't even ask people that. So I think there's something about bringing in small practices that allow our antennae to notice the kind of emergent, changing context. David.
And as it happens, there's a question from online which very much mirrors that last thought from you there. Probably a question which takes us towards our conclusion as well, which is there anything that's now clearer or more strongly felt for you? So what's changed for you about your relationship to complexity and Taoism through writing the book?
Yes. I've answered that in part, I think. It's a great question. I do feel more determined to be myself and show myself that there's something about uniqueness. There's one of my favorite bits I wrote, if you're allowed to have favorite bits you wrote yourself, which is about living the life you have rather than the life you want. There's something about embracing my uniqueness, my qualities, you know, doing my best in the Daoist sense to cultivate myself, to be the best I can be in service of the wider context. So the Daoists are not saying, we're not trying to improve ourselves for the sake of it. They're very clear that we're improving ourselves for the good of the future, for the good of everything, and also for the good of nature. It's quite it's, you know, the Daoist view is quite, you know, brings in the world. It's not just human-centered. So I feel more like being able to say, okay, world, you know, I don't get it all right. You can disagree with me, but this is who I am. And I'm going to do my best. You know, this writing of this book is my form of social activism. I show up, I've written this, I show you myself, I tell you what I think, I'm bringing in my physics, I'm standing with authority. I feel like I'm not, you know, I stand in my ground, in my authority. And that feels important. You know, it's you know, when we all leave this earth, I'd like you to feel not, you know, here was Jean, she was clever, or here was Jean, she was, you know, she was successful, but here was Jean who tried her best to make the world a better place in the way that she understood it, and share that with you. So this is, I think we have to find our own ways, and writing is my way of being active, but it has changed me, and I feel more convinced of that in the writing of it. Ooh, great question.